Jack of all trades, master of none, is a figure of speech that is meant to show how attempting to become an expert in a multitude of disciplines at once is, for the most part, futile. PixelAndy clearly didn't get the memo. Andy has been a dominant force in the 1989 version of Tetris for over 2 years, but in that time he's had to continuously adapt to the ever-evolving landscape of the game. He's been at the forefront of the scene 3 individual times, but in the past few months he's come out of the woodwork to dominate top players in competition, learning a new playstyle that in turn revolutionized his gameplay. This is the story of how PixelAndy rose to the top, the matches that made him a clear #1 place contender, and his case for winning the World Championships in October. Andy was inspired to pick up the game in 2019, after the previous year's World Championship was recommended to him on YouTube. That was the year that caused the scene to surge in popularity, with 16-year-old rookie Joseph Saelee sweeping the 7-time world champ Jonas Neubauer in the finals. Joseph had used the previously uncommon hypertapping technique to aid in his victory, where he was able to manually press the controller at speeds of over 12 times per second to move pieces. This gave a massive advantage, but despite a majority of the next generation of the game picking up tapping, Andy decided to take on DAS. DAS is the built-in piece movement system, where the button can be held down to move pieces at a rate of 10 times per second. But while this was constraining, it was still competitive if a player was able to stack at a high enough level. Andy had a knack for the playstyle, with him maxing out the score counter for the first time in early January of 2020. His play only continued to improve from there, as just 6 months later he achieved the 3rd highest ever score with DAS at the time, a 1.257 million. This was significant because DAS is heavily limited to levels on which the player can reliably score on, hitting a brick wall at level 29 speeds. A 1.25 was nearing the upper limit of what a player could do with the playstyle, and to this day, this score is just 60,000 points short of the current DAS world record. At this point though, Andy knew he was nearing the end of the road with DAS, as its limitations were beginning to show, especially in the competitive format where every game mattered. Inspired by his brother Dog's absurd achievements, Andy made the switch to tapping, and wouldn't you know it, the two would end up facing each other on the world stage, in the 2020 World Championship Finals. Fun fact, this was the first CTWC in its 10-year history that had to be hosted online, but this match between brothers kept up the tradition of every winner being determined under one roof, only this time it was just a bit different. After jumping out to a 2-game lead, Dog was on the ropes, but his incredible heroics in Game 3 turned the tides. This dig allowed for Dog to storm back, and eventually pull off a reverse sweep. Andy's World Championship debut was as strong as he could have hoped for, but the closeness of this game left Andy practicing for future hopes of a world title. Flash forward to the 2021 World Championships, and while the road had been different, Andy and Dog found themselves up against each other once again, only this time in the semifinals. Andy unfortunately suffered a similar fate, stuck behind Dog in a few games too many, but that was all it took for him to make a tournament exit. Something else was different this time around too, as Dog would find out in the finals. A new playstyle had entered the scene, created and popularized by top player Cheez. Rolling was a solution to a long-standing quest to find a way to press buttons on a Nintendo controller with multiple fingers at once. It gave way to piece movement speeds of up to 30 times a second, making it viable to survive on the game's dev-intended killscreen of level 29 for prolonged periods at a time. Dog would go on to win his 2nd title with hypertapping, but both him and Andy knew that rolling was the future. Andy was once again forced to switch to the better of 2 playstyles, but here he was able to once again rise to the top of the scene. It was a months-long effort, as adjusting to a comfortable rolling grip was not the easiest for him. Still, flashes of greatness began to appear in his rolling gameplay, showing that he was becoming a dominant force with the playstyle. This was especially the case on the kill screen, where Andy had previously held the record for most points after level 29 with tapping. Rolling further improved his capabilities here, with his distinctively smart stacking being turned up to 11. He swiftly overtook his tap score PB with a 1.4 million, a game which featured over 500,000 points on the kill screen alone, extending his game all the way out to level 45. From this point onwards, he was a roller, and the limits of what he was capable of in the game would only continue to be pushed further. Andy had already proven himself to be an elite competitive player, but rolling gave him yet another edge against his competition. Classic Tetris Monthly is the premier online tournament during the World Championships off-season, and Andy had already obtained a title back in March of 2021, but the scene had gotten drastically better in the year to follow. Rollers were quickly beginning to populate the bracket, meaning that no lead before level 29 was safe if players were able to score on the kill screen. One thing had remained the same though, Andy's main competition, and in the March 2022 CTM event, he once again faced his brother Dog playing Tetris in the finals. Things were immensely different this time around though, as both players had made the switch to rolling, but Doug still had the competitive edge. He'd go on to score 1.79 and 1.5 million in back-to-back games, and would eventually close out the match with a Game 5 victory. Andy wouldn't let this deter him though, as we'd quickly see in the following months. 14 months removed from his last monthly title, he'd win in May of 2022. 1 month later, he'd do it again, joining the prestigious club of back-to-back monthly winners. This stretch of games was not normal, with Andy breezing past the best Tetris players in the scene. In the process, he'd shoot up to number 2 in tournament ELO, being on one of the most impressive winning streaks that the scene has witnessed in the modern competitive era. This leads us to the obvious question: is this just the beginning for Andy? To answer that, I decided to take a look at the main highlights from this 2-month stretch, attempting to figure out what makes Andy such a tough player to face as he continues to push his rolling to new heights. As a past World Championships player who could be described as very good at the game, I've created an arbitrary list of traits that I believe distinguishes top players. The first is consistency, threatening to put up big scores in nearly every game. The second is aggression, being capable of using calculated risky plays to put pressure on your opponent, which is especially useful past level 29. The third is nerves management, which is easier said than done. Killscreen battles are not the easiest thing to deal with when your opponent has no sign of topping out. With those categories considered, it's time to jump into the match analysis. The first match we'll look at is Andy vs Fractal161 in the May semifinals, and this one stands out for several reasons. Fractal was coming off of a dominant Mega Masters showing in April, where he won in a doubled bracket of 32 elite players. He was hoping to continue this streak, but he likely didn't expect what Andy was able to bring to the table in more than one game. In the first game of the set, both players were dead even into level 26, but Andy got into a bit of trouble high up on the board. He amazingly just needed 2 burns to open back up his well to score Tetrises, but the pieces he got after didn't let him lower his stack. He closed off his left with a T and topped out, with Fractal taking game 1. Game 2 featured strong pace from Andy early on, with him maxing into early level 27. Both players were killscreen capable, so this lead was in no way safe. He was ahead going into level 29, but Fractal was close behind, to the point where he'd end up overtaking Andy with a Tetris on level 32. Andy answered right back, getting a column 7 Tetris to take the lead as soon as he'd lost it. Flash forward just a few levels and both players were boasting 1.4 million scores, meaning that whoever lost this game would be the first person to do so with a score that high. They both crossed into 1.5 territory on level 43, still maintaining safe boards, but all of a sudden Fractal had a barrage of J's, not knowing what to do with them, and promptly topped out shortly after. Andy had survived the 4-minute killscreen battle, but he wasn't done there. In fact, he'd keep playing, rolling over the score counter with an insane 1.6 million. After that, he went full aggressive, getting 5 additional Tetrises to end up with a score just shy of 2.2 million. This game smashed both the losing and overall score records in competition, with this also being Andy's highest ever score that he had achieved. All of this just meant that the match was tied, but heading into game 3, momentum was quickly shifting into Andy's favor. It's incredibly common for players to put up massive games only to fizzle out right after due to nerves or exhaustion, but for these two players, it wasn't happening. Andy maintained a strong lead into the killscreen with Fractal a level ahead, needing almost 100k to chase down Andy's score. He'd managed to rack up that many points, but Andy had jumped up to over 1.1 million into level 34. We were once again in a killscreen showdown. Fractal did end up taking the lead, which prompted Andy to go all out with a clean board. He built out his left, was handed a beautiful sequence, and gets the level 44 Tetris to take the lead just short of a 1.4. The barrage of points was too much for Fractal to handle, and with a sequence of misdrops, he topped out, with Andy winning in stunning fashion for a second time. This was level 58 and 48 for him back to back, but he wasn't done there, securing the match with a 1.5 in the following game. Andy hadn't faltered one bit, with his killscreen endurance being the decisive factor in his victory. He'd go on to win in the finals versus Huff with an impressive 2-game comeback, securing his second of 3 eventual CTM victories. Nerves management? Check. Aggression? Check. And consistency? Double check. Andy had filled all of the boxes against some of the best Tetris players on the planet, with his match against Fractal being part of just a small sample size of matches. To prove this wasn't just a one-off thing, Andy needed to double up on his victory, and in the following month, he'd do exactly that. His performance in June didn't have any particular match that stood out, but instead the tournament run itself was impressive. In his 15 games played over the course of the tournament, Andy maxed out 12 times. Just as impressive was that he reached the kill screen in 14 of those games, with him taking a voluntary top out past the kill screen in a handful of those. He might have not needed consistent 1.4s to win the tournament this time, but he did what he needed to secure 4 victories against some of the best Tetris players on the planet, taking out score world record holder Eric ICX in the finals. This is a telltale attribute of high-level consistency. While Andy faced competitors with much higher personal bests, it didn't matter if they weren't able to play up to their limits. Andy has never been afraid to attempt that, but he's been able to match it with mitigation of risk to the point where he threatens to make a run on the kill screen in nearly every game. This leaves us wondering about the future of PixelAndy, with the most important event in Tetris coming up in just a few short months. For the CTWC that's right around the corner in October, it appears that for the time being, Andy has one primary counter. That would be his brother Dog, a player who is still improving as a roller and who towers over Andy with a 14-4 tournament record. As much as things change, this brother rivalry will likely stay the same. We're also entering the stretch in the year where several players come out of the woodwork as top contenders, so that's something to watch as we approach the fall. We'll see if Andy holds on to the top spot, but for the time being, he's my pick as the one to watch as we near the World Championships. As for that event, it's not a guarantee that Andy or Dog attend, and this is unfortunately one of the downsides of the venue being in person. It's not a sure thing that every elite player across the scene can make it, unlike with the past 2 online World Championships. For those who can attend, and even for people watching at home, it'll be an event like no other, and I'm excited to see what the scene will look like in just a matter of months. Make sure to check out Andy's YouTube and Twitch in the description below. If you liked the video, make sure to subscribe so you won't miss Tetris videos just like this one. Thank you very much for watching.